It's the mother of all talk shows. It's the mother of all talk shows. It's the mother of all talk shows. Go get 'em, George.
George Galloway, and the mother of all talk shows. Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway.
The US is the enemy of the West, says the Financial Times. No FT, no comment. And the charge of the woke brigade assembles in London, where Sir Keir Starmer has given little Zelensky £4 billion in 2 days. And this is the land where there's a big black hole in our public finances, which meant that our old age pensioners had to shiver through this winter. And Keir Starmer announces he'll be putting British boots on the ground and planes in the air. Though, as Colonel Douglas Macgregor pointed out immediately afterwards, that would mean World War III. Well, it's all coming up this evening, because this is the mother of all talk shows. Stay tuned.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway, the mother of all talk shows. With George Galloway, the world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
Well, if the Americans are the enemy of the West, it begs the obvious question: who are these Wests? What kind of classification is it that does not include the biggest country in Europe and now doesn't include the United States of America? It doesn't include Latin America. We've all long gotten used to that. It does have some geographical peculiarities. Australia and New Zealand are, for now at least, a part of the West. So is Japan, although tell that to the men that were building the bridge over the River Kwai. Tell them that in the camp at Tenko. The idea that the United States is now the enemy of the West immediately brands the people who are describing it thus as really living on another planet. But then we know already that they do. You'll be familiar with the pampered, pompadour pop stars who gathered at the height of the Ethiopian famine to sing, "We are the world." They really do think they are the world, and the they is getting smaller by the day. Who is the West? Is it the TikTok army of Norway that I just saw there? The hippie army of the Netherlands, of fond memory, with flowers in their hair and legalized weed in their knapsacks? Who exactly is this coalition of the willing? Believe it or not, he actually said that. Keir Starmer actually used the phrase that Tony Blair used to assemble a group of people to invade and occupy Iraq in the biggest foreign policy blunder since First World War. He used it again. He's assembling a coalition of the willing, a coalition of the killing, we call Tony Blair's, but actually the killing will be almost all the other way around in Keir Starmer's coalition. This charge of the woke brigade gathered in London today. The King of England was pimped out by a here today, gone tomorrow politician. First, he was forced into signing a letter inviting Donald Trump to come for a second state visit, although the horses are still recovering from the fright of his last one. And then Zelensky gets taken to meet the king. You can forget about Donald Trump coming now. If you'll forgive me putting it this way, why would Donald Trump want sloppy seconds of King Charles III? There'll be no state visit by Donald Trump, and it's maybe just as well, because the Conservative Party, long the traditional right-wing party of the country, long the most pro-American of all the parties, declared today that Donald Trump will not be welcome on a state visit to Britain until he has proved to Kemi Badenoch that he's a reliable enough ally of this now amorphous, mysterious, actually, West. So I want to take a closer look at who and what the West is, because if we're about to form a coalition of the killing to invade Ukraine, despite the warning from Russia that it will inevitably lead to World War III, we better know the mighty armies that we're dealing with. Let's start with the TikTok army of Norway. They were there in front of their weapons, in their fatigues, literally doing a TikTok dance in celebration of the fact that a major Norwegian company had refused to refuel the nuclear submarines belonging to the United States Navy. That's the United States Navy protecting them. They refused to give it fuel. Just yesterday, the Norwegian army didn't stand up in the Second World War to too much examination. Indeed, it didn't stand up to any examination at all. It was occupied by Hitler before you could say Jack Robinson. Or what about the Swedish army? Well, they declared neutrality so that Hitler wouldn't have to fight them in order to occupy them, which he very promptly did. There's the Danish army, there's the Dutch army, there's the Portuguese army, there's the Spanish army, there's the Italian army, whose tanks have 1 forward gear and 5 reverse gears. And then there's the German army. Remember them? The putative Prime Minister, Chancellor of Germany, actually put out a picture of himself and branded himself the leader of the free world. Jawohl, mein Führer, said nobody at all. Not even the 25% of the German people who voted in the elections last week can fancy being the leader of the free world, especially if that means having to re-enter Ukraine with force, because they took quite a bloody good hiding the last time that they were there. Or it could be the British Army that will lead this coalition of the willing. It could be the British Army whose one aircraft carrier is unable to leave the port right now, running repairs and all that, you know. Probably just as well, because it would not last the proverbial 5 minutes. Or maybe Britain's 40 serviceable tanks. 40 serviceable tanks. Russia has 9,000 tanks on the battlefield. Britain has 40 that are capable of being sent into action, though you'd need to get them from Britain to the Ukrainian battlefront without further mishap, or you'd be down to 39, or maybe 38. Or maybe it's the British Army as a whole. Well, I now discover that we have 74,000 soldiers in the British Army. That's roundabout the crowd at Old Trafford this very afternoon. Although only half of that 79,000, only half of them are frontline troops. The rest are medics and orderlies and cooks and barbers and the like. And 25% of that half are unavailable for combat at any one time for one reason or another. So it's a dad's army, really, that they're assembling there. And they're throwing money at Zelensky like it went out of fashion. As I told you, 4 billion British pounds were given to Zelensky across 2 days by Sir Keir Starmer in a country so straitened that we are staring down the barrel of another recession. Our old age pensioners are freezing. 4 million of our children are hungry. Our public realm is crumbling to dust in front of our eyes. Our cities, no-go areas for the police in many places in the country. Boys stabbing each other. Girls stabbing old age pensioners, as happened in London the night before last. 3 girls, teenager, 14, 15, 16, arrested after allegedly murdering an old age pensioner on the streets of Britain. You'd think that a Labour government might be inclined to stay at home and fix the roof in our own country, instead of claiming there's no money to fix the roof because I've given it all so that Zelensky can sniff it up his proverbial hooter. But that's what's happening. And I got to asking myself, what's he going to spend this money on? Donald Trump has already said there'll be no more American weapons sent to Ukraine. The European armories are empty. It would take a lead time of a year or 2 years to order new tanks from a factory. What is this money for if it is not money laundering? If it is not to come back to the various countries giving this largesse in kickbacks for the political class, like it is now abundantly clear it has been doing under both the Obama and the Biden administrations. But that didn't stop the money flow continuing. And little Macron, whose wife is alleged to have sexually molested him at the age of 14 when she was 40, is now, according to Candace Owens, revealed to be a man, a transgender woman. That's what I mean about the charge of the woke brigade. You know, are we really going into battle behind Mr. and Mrs. Macron? Are we really going into battle behind the self-appointed Führer of the free world, Mr. Metz or Merz or Mercedes, whatever it is they call him. Are we really sending our soldiers into harm's way as part of this coalition, riding once more into the valley of death? Gallant, no doubt, but it is called the valley of death for a reason. Credit to Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. They have seen the light. That's why the FT has banished them from the West. Hard luck. Little Belgium has taken your place. President Trump, you're no longer a pucka member of the Western master race, which, as Lavrov said today, for 500 years has been the source of almost all of the trouble in the world. Well, we ain't done yet. The sun may be setting on our economies. Our societies may be broke and broken. Our industries may be closing in the name of greenery, quackery, and the rest. It is not inspiring to me. And it will not be inspiring to potential recruits of the British Armed Forces, whose numbers are falling like a stone. Which is why I have to reiterate, if the boots that you're going to put on the ground, Keir Starmer, in any way involve the forced conscription of our young men and women into your fool's errand in Ukraine, we will oppose you with every fiber of our being. You'll have to imprison all of us. We will organize a mass movement against conscription in Britain, the like of which you cannot even imagine. We'll hide conscripts to keep them out of your grisly clutches. We will conduct a campaign of peaceful civil disobedience in Britain that will bring your conscription and your war drive grinding to a halt. We will make you look like a fool in front of the rest of the woke brigade you clearly hope to lead. Which brings me to the events in the Oval Office. I must tell you, I've been a little bit surprised at some of the people who saw the situation diametrically opposite to mine. Lindsey German, for example, the convener of the Stop the War Coalition, of which I was a co-founder along with her, she tweeted that it was a disgraceful display of bullying by Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. The bullies were the guys telling Zelensky that this war has to stop. The victim of the bullying was the guy who turned up looking like a ragged arse street corner boy, a thug, strutting around from a sedentary position, demanding more money, more weapons, more war. How does your sympathy lie with the guy demanding more war and your allocation of the title thuggery go to the guys that were telling him it's all over, we're pulling stumps, we're going to negotiate an end to this? You're gambling with World War III, Trump told him. How dare you disrespect us, said the Vice President J.D. Vance. In reply to which, Zelensky called him a lying bitch. In Russian, of course, because Ukrainian is not his first language. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm for candor. I don't really care that he doesn't wear a suit. The Pope doesn't wear a suit to the Oval Office either. I don't even care that he roughs up the company that he's in. But when you are $500 billion in debt to somebody, the simplest ABC of etiquette and diplomacy would tell you that you better be on your best behavior, especially when you've come to demand that they give you even more money, even more weapons. So that tells me that Zelensky is an idiot, perhaps a chemically fueled idiot, because nobody but an idiot would turn up behaving like that, dressed like that, calling the vice president to his face a lying bitch like that, unless he had lost the balance of his sensibilities. So I'm asking you, if this really is a man to whom we should be giving even more money and even more weapons, I'll tell you what's going to happen to the boots on the ground and the planes in the air that Keir Starmer promised today in public. The airplanes will be shot down out of the sky if they even get off the runway. Whether they take off from Poland or whether they take off from the soon-to-be entirely inoperable Ukrainian airfields, they will be shot from the sky. And still more British treasure, and more importantly, still more British servicemen's blood will be lost for nothing. And as for the shoes, they will soon be empty shoes, because with just one missile, the Russian armed forces will take out the entire Barmy army sent by Starmer into that valley of death. And so it is with great earnestness I appeal to my fellow countrymen and women. I appeal even to the Prime Minister, but more, I appeal to His Majesty the King, being abused and cruelly abused in the service of Keir Starmer's woke political brigade. Don't do it. Don't send our gallant young men and women, especially if you've conscripted them and forced them on to a horse into the valley of death they rode. Don't do it. This is the mother of all talk shows. Stay tuned.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special announcement. A big thank you to all our wonderful listeners, as the Mother of All Talk Shows podcast is now one of the most listened to political podcasts in the entire world. We are the #1 English-speaking political podcast in the Middle East, and in the last year alone have charted in the top 10 in podcast land in Pakistan, Russia, and China. Like, rate, and subscribe to the Moats Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts to be a part of the fastest rising independent news show in the world.
You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows with George Galloway.
So we're asking in the poll tonight, did Zelensky blow Ukraine's last chance in the Oval Office? I'm sure blow is a pun of some sort. You can answer yes or no on the Telegram. That's t.me/George Galloway. You should be following me on there in any case. On my X, my Twitter, on the YouTube community poll, or on the YouTube stream. If you are watching on the YouTube stream, please make sure that you subscribe to my YouTube channel. 23,500 people have already voted in this poll, and it's not looking good for the blow hard Zelensky. If you want to call the show, it's toll free in the United States and Canada. The number is +1 844 944 3344. It's free of charge in the United Kingdom and Ireland, 08081 965522. And the worldwide number is 0044 203 966 2625. Well, who better to ask as we stand on the brink of what Colonel McGregor called World War III than the veritable Colonel Daniel L. Davis, the host of the unmissable Daniel Davis Deep Dive. Colonel Davis, always a pleasure to see you. Before we turn to the war itself, I wonder how you saw the events in the Oval Office. There seems to be a peculiar dichotomy. Western liberals who've now expelled your country from the West and who believe they are the world were scandalized, shocked, like the police captain in Casablanca when he discovered there was gambling going on in Rick's Cafe. And most American people who kind of thought that Zelensky got what he had coming. What was your take?
Well, I got to say, I was just absolutely shocked. I was literally 90 seconds from going on the air with the show we had prepared when my producer, Gary, saw the images of, on the side, because he'd been monitoring it, and he saw this argument going on. And so we immediately cut our show and just went with what was going on almost live as we were talking about it. And I just couldn't believe what I was seeing, because especially when I went back and watched the whole thing in context and watched the last few minutes, as leading into it. I did a deep dive on this whole issue and how it came about. And you can see very clearly the United States had no intention of having any kind of an explosion going on there. In fact, all they wanted to do was just have a signing ceremony and move on to whatever's next. Apparently, they didn't even want to have him in the White House for that. That was something that Zelensky himself really pressed for because of the optics. And then when you see him actually bait the vice president, and then he just kept on going. Then after it went to the president, he just kept going. He would not shut up. He just kept his mouth going, causing more of this rift. Now, what I also did in a show I did earlier today, actually, especially after he went with Sir Keir Starmer and some of the comments that he made there, what I have observed is there is this huge absence of knowledge about what's actually at stake here. You have people who already didn't like Trump, who were just beside themselves, both in the U.S. and in Europe, who were just going crazy about it and just saying they were embarrassed, they were ashamed, how undiplomatic, etc. And if you already didn't like Zelensky, then you thought that Trump and Vance made the right call. But something you said just a second ago before we came on the air here, I think is missed by so many people. This guy, forget about the $500 billion that he's in debt to the West or whatever, but his lifeblood is on the line here. And if he doesn't have the United States backstop, even Starmer himself said if the U.S. doesn't backstop these alleged peacekeeping troops that he wants to put into Ukraine, he said it's not going to work. Trump absolutely said we're not going to do that. And so to then insult the president of the United States and vice president on the very floor, the Oval Office of the symbol of American power in the White House, and think that there's not going to be a negative reaction is just baffling to me, because he is basically, Zelensky is playing with the lives of his people. Because, George, I'll tell you the one thing that nobody seems to understand, or at least not many in the West. The war is already decided. It's only the only thing still to determine is how bad the loss will be for Ukraine. Zelensky refused to negotiate and refused to administer the Minsk Accords. He refused the December 2021 offer that Putin gave again to avoid war. He refused the Istanbul meetings. He refused the June 2024 opportunity, and he's refusing the one now. He is the biggest impediment to peace, quantifiably, and he continues to send his men out every day to pointlessly die in a war that cannot be won. And people still have the audacity to suggest that Trump did something wrong, who expressly said, I want the killing to stop. If anybody cares about the people of Ukraine, it's Donald Trump.
The likelihood of him being overthrown by his own officer class must surely be high. I mean, plenty of rulers have been overthrown for much less egregious own goals than that we saw this week. It's a chance for somebody to make a name for themselves and become the president of whatever is going to be left of Ukraine. And yet there seems to be quiet on the home front for him. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I actually asked somebody, and I won't betray their source, but it's somebody well placed in the Ukrainian government, because I just kind of assumed that was going to be a growing risk at this. Because why do people want to send their sons and daughters off to die in a war that that's almost certain death for no gain to their country? And they said that he has such a control of the security apparatuses there, and so many people benefit from the continuation of the war, that there is a cocoon and a bubble around him that's actually pretty effective, because he silences anybody who has stands up against him inside. So apparently his security is pretty tight in Kiev right now.
I interpreted some of the things he said to Trump as a threat. He said, you have this big ocean, but you might not always have it. He implied that some harm was going to come to the United States. And one of the Ukrainian military outfits last night effectively threatened to unleash the diaspora in Canada and in the United States against the security of your country. And there was a big crowd in Times Square. A lot of them military age, by the way. Makes you wonder why they're in New York and not in Kupiansk.
They're all that excited.
Danger.
How about putting them on the front line?
Yeah, well, if I was Trump, I would have said, go to the airport now. We'll fly you free of charge back to your country and then to the front lines. Do you think, Donald Trump's there was 2 attempts to assassinate him in the last year. Both of them had a Ukraine connection. And the second of them, the one in Florida, was explicitly an activist in the Ukraine cause, a man who was recruiting for the so-called Foreign Legion of mercenaries to go and fight in Ukraine. I hope Donald Trump's doubled down on his security, Colonel.
Yeah, I'm sure that he has. There's no question that he has, especially after those attempts. He won't take any chances at all. I've personally seen the motorcade roll past me once, and it's a lot more robust than it used to be, I can assure you. But one of the things that it still puzzles me to a certain extent, why so many people in Europe were fawning over themselves to say that they're going to go for as long as it takes. I mean, they're repeating things of Biden, that our support is enduring, it's unfaltering, it's unwavering, and all this kind of stuff. And I'm just like, did you guys not pay attention in 2023, when everything in the world was given to the Ukraine side to give them every chance to actually expel Russia? It broke its teeth on the first line of defense, never made it past there. Then in all of 2024, they kept saying, we need $61 billion from the U.S. administration. That'll make the difference. They got it. It didn't make any difference. In fact, ironically, after that money was allocated, the losses accelerated. They kept moving better. So if you have 24 straight months of military defeat and failure, by what rationale do you say we're going to push harder, when at the same time you see the Russian side is growing bigger and bigger by the day? Industrial capacity, the experience of their troops. They have probably, depending on who you listen to, either Zelensky or some of his other intelligence folks, somewhere between 150,000 Russians not in contact, or another batch of 200,000, according to the Russian side, on the east of Pokrovsk. If either of those kicks off in, say in a spring offensive with these brittle lines, this war could be over quickly, because then it would be a military defeat. The only thing that could save Ukraine now is to stop the killing today, have us, end it as the best terms you can get right now, because if you don't, hundreds of thousands of more could die, and then it's a military defeat, and Putin then just gives terms of surrender. There won't even be negotiations. That is what is at stake right now.
We have now reached, and forgive me, Colonel, I fought for this all my life. We have now reached the stage where NATO is operatively defunct. You've got a country like Norway refusing to refuel American nuclear submarines that are patrolling the waters of Norway to defend Norway as a NATO ally. You have open preparation for a European treaty organization, a European defense architecture, Macron called it today. They don't want you. So why are you still paying? Why have you still got all these soldiers over here at your country's expense? Shouldn't your country read the room and say, we've got better things to do with our money and men?
Well, I think that the room is being read, and I think that you're probably going to see a reduction in U.S. troops in Europe. You're probably going to see them sent down to our southern border. I expect that they'll probably continue on with that. But listen, I think your bigger point is to the true. I think that NATO, and so far from just the U.S. portion of this, even disputes within the alliance itself, is becoming more fractured by the day. And that tells you something. That tells you that they don't actually believe that Russia is going to conquer Ukraine and then come rolling to the west. And ironically, this is almost perversely, if you wanted to increase the chance of that happen, then keep telling Russia we don't want peace, we just want to keep fighting. When Russia sees all of these European leaders today give all this support financially and emotionally to Zelensky to keep fighting, what does that tell them? That tells them that Europe is their enemy, and it makes it more likely they're going to keep building up their military even after they finish off with Ukraine. And then maybe it's, they bring to the fore what they have feared the most. Don't give Russia a chance and a reason to think they have something to fear from Europe in the war, and let's get back to some kind of normal relations that everybody can benefit from and nobody has to die. That is absolutely on the table here, and it puzzles me why the European leaders want to go down a path that can't succeed.
Well, none of them ever answer the obvious conundrum. If Russia is so weak that giving Ukraine some more weapons and some more money, Ukraine could defeat them. And yet the same Russia is so strong, it can be in Trafalgar Square before you know it. I mean, these two things cannot both be true, Colonel.
They can't. Yeah, those things can't coexist at all. And listen, if this war had ended in Istanbul in April of 2022, then Russia would have stopped right there. They wouldn't have gone any further. They'd have gone back to their barracks and, started rebuilding and recouping from the war. All this terrain would have been left over to Ukraine, and there would have been no more reason for there to be any kind of conflict between NATO and the other side. If you care about peace and security for Europe, then the most rational, logical thing is to get the war over with. Maybe you can help me out. Why do they want to keep on pressing? Because if this thing goes nuclear, then it's game over for everybody. Everybody will lose. Nobody will win. But yet you want to keep pushing in a direction where that stays on the table as a possibility. And it's just baffling to me.
Well, it's game over, and only for Europe. Not for the United States. They would not be in that nuclear war. They've made it clear that they will not be giving the security guarantees which both Starmer and Macron said today were indispensable. So in that sense, is it all a big bluff, Colonel? Because it falls at the first hurdle.
Because, see, when NATO Article 5 was created in 1949, it was sacrosanct, and everybody needed everybody else because there was a genuine, no kidding, existential threat, both conventionally and nuclear, from the Soviet Union. So that was necessary. And it was only going to be put in effect if they were attacked. But in the current environment, and by the way, even in the original rendition of the Article 5 version in 1949, it said that an attack on one will be considered an attack on all, and each individual country and their political organizations will decide how best to respond, whether that's to join in a military attack or money or whatever. Nobody ever had an automatic trigger that it's everybody going to go fight if one was attacked. But especially in this environment here, if the United States sees a situation developing to where it's the NATO countries themselves from Europe's side that are actually provoking a war here, we're not going to come into that. That would be suicidal. We would, just like you described there, why would we get into a nuclear war when we're not threatened, when we know for sure there would be nuclear missiles coming in return should we engage in that? We won't. We're not going to do that because we're not suicidal. And the European countries need to understand that Article 5 means exactly what it says if we're attacked, not because we provoke an attack.
Well, the reason I use the word bluff, to me it falls at the first hurdle. If you are saying, as both Starmer and Macron said today, that it would require this peace plan that they're going to come up with, which presumably they think will be more stylish, maybe, more French than the Trump peace plan, they're going to present it to the United States. And both have stressed that its implementation would have to be subject to United States security guarantees. So the first hurdle is, can you get those United States security guarantees? But Trump has already stated multiple times that he is not interested in giving security guarantees. He wants to end this war. So I'm wondering if it's all, you know, huff and puff. What do you think? Your
framing is perfect. It falls on the first hurdle. Guaranteed, there's no chance that Trump is going to backstop, is the word that Zelensky used on American television on Friday night, that many in Europe say, yes, Starmer himself, it has to have American backing. It's not going to have American backing. And by the way, no one's examining the other half of this equation, which is what the Russians are saying. And what everything comes down to is, what can the Russians do? What can the European side do? Russia can ignore everything and just keep fighting until they have won on the battlefield everything they think they need to get their security in. Ergo, they will not agree to NATO's troops of any kind as peacekeeping, especially those that would be backed up by the U.S. They will also insist on demilitarization. I think the number is 85,000 total armed forces in the Ukraine that they're talking about, and denazification, meaning they have to have, the Ukraine side has to have an election with a new head of state that's picked by their people. And nobody's talking. I bet the Starmer and Macron didn't say anything about any of those figures. And so it falls on the first hurdle, but if somehow it cleared the first, it would fall on the second, which is that the Russians won't agree to that, and they have the power not to. And I keep saying this, it just baffles me why these leaders and these heads of state don't see such elementary issues.
Colonel Davis, host of Daniel Davis Deep Dive, a must-watch. Thank you for joining us this evening on the Mother of
Always my pleasure, sir.
Shows.
Thank you.
Much appreciated, sir. Let me take a quick break, then it's your calls up to the hour. Stay tuned. President Putin definitely isn't Nikita Khrushchev, who was a clown, in my opinion. Neither is he Stalin, but he's much closer to Stalin than any other Russian leader has ever been. He has a mind that calamity has hardened and turned to steel. He is extremely cautious, but cautious only for a purpose. He is cautious in the hope that the goals of the operation that he's involved the country in can be achieved. But no one should mistake that caution for weakness. I've met the man. 3 times I've met him. I've met lots of leaders. I've met leaders from all over the world, including all of the British leaders that I sat in Parliament under. Vladimir Putin is a very determined guy. He has a clear set of goals. He told you about them in 2007 in Munich. He warned you in 2007 that Russia regarded NATO encroachment in Ukraine as a red line matter for the existential survival of the Russian Federation, which it is his job to defend, and nobody should make the mistake of thinking that he will not do that job. People misunderestimated Stalin, but Stalin wasn't Stalin when he told the beast of Berlin that we will crush you in your lair. Stalin wasn't Stalin. Putin isn't Stalin. Trust me on that.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Wow, almost 30,000 people have voted already in the poll. Did Zelensky blow Ukraine's last chance in the Oval Office? Yes or no? You can vote on my Telegram channel, t.me/George Galloway, on my X, my Twitter, on the YouTube community poll, or on the YouTube stream. Let's go straight to the calls, where I understand there's record demand to get through. Anne is in Bedford in England and is a new caller on Zelensky. Anne, you're particularly welcome. What would you like to say?
Thank you, George, and good evening. Well, I've been following this Ukraine business for quite some while. In fact, it drew my attention when I was watching YouTube and the summer camps the Nazis, or the Azov Nazis, had for the youth. And that appalled me, and I kept following it year after year. And when Zelensky arrived on the scene, I thought, this is bad news. And I've been watching him ever since. And I do not like him. I can't stand looking or listening to him, but I do, because we need two sides to the story. His behavior in the office, in the Oval Office, was absolutely disgraceful. Excuse me. I have a voice problem. Disgraceful. His body language, eyebrows, puffing, crossing arms, you know, yeah. And he obviously doesn't understand that this is all about a peace deal. Like Daniel Davis pointed out, America wants peace, no more killing. And, yeah, just appalled.
Yeah, I mean, I've had at least 3 encounters this weekend, all of which surprised me, of people who see it the same way as the Stop the War convener did, namely that that Trump was at fault. But Trump was trying to stop the war, and Zelensky was demanding even more money and weapons to keep the war going. I mean, there's no neutrality in that, Anne. You're either for the war ending or you're for the war continuing. And so to blame the guys that are trying to end it seems perverse to me. Last word to you, Anne.
Yes, I recommend to everybody to watch the whole, not into the meeting, and also maybe watch the body language guy called Jesus something. He's good.
Yeah, he was rolling his eyes, he was frowning, he was folding his arms. He wasn't acting like, look, if I owed somebody 500 billion, I wouldn't have acted that way. Let me put it in that way. Anne in Bedford, a new caller, and most welcome indeed. Comments on YouTube, you can scan the QR code now, leave a comment on the YouTube stream, as Convex Fungus has. Zelensky got owned. He looked like a little school kid getting told off by his maths teacher. And Lockmain Regemi says, say what you want about Zelensky, but if you compare him to Macron, Keir Starmer and King Abdullah put together, one thing is certain, he's not a coward or ready to be humiliated. That's a fair point, actually. Jojo AA says, UK is suffering from price rises, council tax and service charges, whilst millions are passed to Zelensky to keep fighting a war he can never win. Only one thing wrong there, Jojo. It's not millions, it's billions. Oliver Law 02 says, I'm going to be told after April by the HMRC, that's the tax authorities, the IRS in Britain, that I owe Ukraine £3,300 this year. Oliver's breaking it down to what each of our individual bills would be. Jimmy Chin says Zelensky's on the back burner for now. Trump's Middle Eastern policies are now a priority. Let's take another call from Dan in South Shields. Again, a new caller, and particularly welcome for that. Go ahead, Dan.
Good evening, George. Like Anne, I'd also like to speak about Zelensky's visit, and particularly the point that you raised earlier about the comments about him being asked to wear a suit. And I've noticed this is something that's gained a lot of consternation from the pro-Ukraine journalists and the like. And what I want to bring up is it's not an issue of this kind of formality of expecting a visitor to wear a suit. It's more that this military fancy dress, this cosplay that he's been wearing, is becoming increasingly asinine, increasingly ridiculous, when we've all watched him for 3 years, jetting around the place, being treated to ostentatious meetings with celebrities, world leaders, big feasts like the one that Donald Trump's staffers ended up eating for him on Friday night, and his wife being taken on these lavish shopping sprees. It strikes us very much like this was the start of a PR operation, which we all saw clearly that his previous handlers had clearly invented for him, this military persona, dressing him up like Fidel, like Che, even though he was nothing of a military man or a fighter in the trenches like them, but an actor playing a role. And increasingly as this has gone on and people have become jaded to this representation, I think we've all seen that it's becoming increasingly like the film Wag the Dog, where we have this almost cartoon-like constructed figure, this character of Zelensky that was holed up and playing a role for a few years, and has increasingly become to believe his own character, believe his own hype, and ended up quite rabid, biting the hands of his masters. And I think the way things are going, he may end up going the same way as other American attack dogs that eventually turned rabid, like Noriega, Bin Laden, Saddam, and others.
Wow, where have you been? Dan, that is the best debut call we've ever had on the mother of all talk shows. Don't be a stranger. I can't disagree with any word that you said, and you said it so eloquently. I believe that Zelensky will end up in that dingy alleyway filled with used prophylactics and former friends of the United States of America. A big thank you to this week's top donors who visited the Moats.tv website. Stuart Oram, Louis Norozi, Joanna Blythman, and Graham Briggs White, who's a very big supporter of ours in any case, as well as Eddie Lowe. I thank every one of you in that gold-plated list I've just read, but every one of you who's given anything at all, even $1, £1, €1. It's simple. Go to the website and click. I really mean it, even if it's £1, but you have to give something. Otherwise, you're getting this show twice a week for free when it can't be made for free. So if you value it, please give us generously as you're able on Moats.tv. Paul is in South Africa on Piers Morgan. Oh, I wasn't going to mention him. Anyway, you're welcome, Paul. Go ahead.
Thanks, George. Yeah, look, you did very well the other night. Of course, you're beating once again. And you did say the other week, you cannot understand why he keeps calling you back. Well, the reason, of course, is because you keep beating him. His ego doesn't allow that. He wants to beat you, and when he does, he will never call you again. But I have a second thing I'd like to mention. I admire the fact that you climbed through the window Winnie Mandela in Stanford. That's very courageous of you. The way you spoke about her, it sounded like some really positive thoughts of her. But you realise, of course, that she in fact murdered 14-year-old Stumpy by stabbing him in the neck with a pair of scissors in her house in Soweto. And her so-called football team, who stayed with her in this massive house, 21 of them, were actually a gang of killers. And they used to necklace people out of the streets. And they actually dumped Stumpy's body in the fields. You're very influential. People listen to you, and if they mistake what you say about her as admiration, I think I would like you just to say that you still admire her.
Paul, this has been a very bad line, but I got the gist of both parts of your contribution. If I'm deficient in any way in answering them, then call back on another occasion or send a message that we will read out if I mischaracterize what you said in any way. First of all, Piers Morgan keeps calling me back because I make him a lot of money. He gets paid a lot of money for every click on his YouTube channel. And when he has me on, he gets one hell of a lot of clicks. So the reason I wasn't going to mention him is I kind of think that I probably earned him more than enough money to be going on with. But the second reason why he invites me on, I'm beginning to characterize as a kind of masochism, because it's not only me. He has people on other than me who give him a bloody good hiding. And in some cases, over and over again. In my case, over and over again. And then I learned from Tucker Carlson, unless Tucker Carlson's lying on air, which I very much doubt, Piers Morgan hates Israel with every fiber of his being. That's what Tucker said, that Piers Morgan had just said to him off camera before they began their interview. So that leads me to a third aspect, that Morgan doesn't actually believe the things he's saying, and that he is capable of bearing the impression of the last person who sat upon him. And he is saying it for shekels. If he hates Israel with every fiber of his being, how come for 16 straight months he was Netanyahu's chief bitch on the internet? How? How's that possible? Well, I know how I would explain it. The usual. If you like, the Epstein question. Are these people saying things because they have been compromised or because they are being enriched by saying it? I don't know what is the case in the case of Piers Morgan. I don't know if it's these two things or something else. But if he hates Israel with every fiber of his being, but spends the entire course of the genocide not just defending Israel, but witch hunting anybody who stood up to oppose Israel, that's a very peculiar state of affairs indeed. Now, the second part of your contribution, and again, if I'm mischaracterizing you, do let me know, was the hairy old attack on Winnie Mandela. And in the you brought it all out. necklaces, Stompy, all these issues from many decades, 4 decades ago, in the heat of the freedom struggle against the hated apartheid system. If you are asking me to condemn the liberation movement and the struggle that they waged against apartheid, against the Boer, whose boot was on their neck and who oppressed them for decades in a fascistic apartheid manner, I will never do that. It doesn't mean that I agree with every tactic of the liberation movement. It doesn't mean that I love every person that was in the liberation movement, but I will not condemn them for a white South African 4 decades after the victory. I will never do that. And if you knew me at all, you would not expect me to. Winnie Mandela was the product of decades of apartheid oppression, the enforced separation from her husband, our leader, Nelson Mandela, for almost 3 decades, bringing up a large family alone in the townships of South Africa before her banishment to Brandfort, to which you referred. Winnie Mandela was living in the ghetto, and because she was Winnie Mandela, she was inevitably in a leading position in the freedom struggle. She gathered around her anyone who would gather around her to fight the Boer, to fight the apartheid system. And when collaborators with the system were uncovered, they were horrifically dealt with, no doubt. And there will be some who were accused of being collaborators who were not, in fact, so. All of these things happen in a revolution. The victory of the South African people was a revolution, an armed revolution. And the white South Africans fought until they could fight no more to maintain their privilege, their oppression, and their grotesquely unequal share of the land and the wealth of South Africa. A grotesquely unequal share they continue to enjoy today. Paul, do let me know if I didn't do justice to the points that you were making. This is the mother of all talk shows. I've got some great stuff coming up for you in the second hour. You don't want to miss it. Stay tuned. Big thanks to this week's top donors who visited the new Moats.tv website. Thank you very much, all of you. And I'm really going to make this point as firmly as I can. Every one of you has to go to Moats.tv and donate something, even if it is £1, even if it is $1, €1. Nothing comes for free. 2 shows a week cannot be produced for free. We need every person watching to donate at least £1, $1, €1. I can't put it more clearly than that.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Well, look, our next guest is the best and most honest foreign journalist in Moscow. There are other foreigners pretending to be journalists in Moscow, though they are quite often under cover. In any case, when they are not, they are lying, twisting propagandists for the countries, or the regimes rather, the governments of the countries from which they come. Che Bose is an Irish man a European, a Westerner, even the FT would have to agree that he's a Western journalist, but he's based in Moscow. And over the last period in particular, he has produced the best, the most visceral, bristling commentary of this bloody affair known as the NATO war on Russia. So, political commentator Che Bose joins us again tonight here on the Mother of All Talk Shows. Che, first of all, let me get a Russian perspective from your side. What did you pick up in Moscow about the scenes in Washington that happened this week? Laughter, joy, tears, disbelief, or all of them?
Well, George, you can imagine it's been a mixture of all three. I'm, reminded of the term. It's a German term. It's a beautiful word in the German language, Schadenfreude, which essentially translates into, hard to describe it, but it translates into sort of, reveling in the sort of distress of an enemy. Now, there's less of that than you would have imagined in Moscow. I think the first response was abject shock. I mean, nobody expected this. After the toing and froing with Zelensky, he will sign, he won't sign, President Trump's dictator comments, or did I call him that? So people were sort of expecting a rapprochement between the two, that a PR exercise would be pushed over the line in order to get something from this deal, this minerals deal, which is a paper tiger in many ways. And interestingly, just prior to this meltdown in the Oval Office, Donald Trump had made a very interesting comment on Fox Radio. It wasn't that widely publicized, but he had said, look, we don't know what's in Ukraine. We don't know how much minerals are there. We don't know, do they have any minerals at all? But at least it's something. It's going to get us something back, so we're going to kind of pursue it. He sounded kind of tired at that stage. Now, remember, very senior officials had gone to Kiev and had been screamed at, apparently, by Zelensky, to the dismay of the regime there. And it culminated in this trip. The view here is one of, amazement, but not surprise. I saw a very good meme, which I posted on my X, of Donald Trump calling Vladimir Putin and saying he's completely insane. And President Putin saying, yeah, told you, kind of thing. So there's a kind of a sense here in Russia that, and we told you so, that it's very difficult to deal with this individual, that he's not a statesman. And everything that you know in the West about Volodymyr Zelensky, of course, has been manufactured. This manufactured Churchillian figure. And you and I, as people who've studied history, know that Volodymyr Zelensky, whatever you think about Churchill, I'm an Irishman, and I'd have problems with Winston Churchill, but you can't argue that the man was a giant of international politics. He loved his country, even though he may have been a very flawed individual. To sort of portray Volodymyr Zelensky as a Churchillian figure, as soon as you heard that, people should have sat up and said, there's something wrong here. The man is essentially an accelerated stooge of an oligarch, Ihor Khoiminski. And I've written this week long passages about this, particularly for the American audience, to introduce them to who this man really is. And in Russia, people are very well educated politically. They want to talk about politics. So there's been a sense of shock. There's now a sense of, well, we've told you so, but what happens next? And what's important about this, I think, from here, from this side of the pond, if you like, is how Europe is reacting, how Europe is scurrying around in this vacuum trying to portray some sort of plausibility to the war, that they're so far up this war, the pipe of this war, people like von der Leyen, such investment in political capital, in fiscal capital, in the self-harm sanctions that have destroyed and degraded the beating heart of Europe's economy, Germany, the amount of political careers that have failed as a result of this utterly foolhardy support of the war. That is how the Europeans are going to try to cobble together some sort of plausibility to continuing this war, while the Americans, this Leviathan, and we all know when America motivates itself to get behind somebody, it's very hard to defeat them. Ask the Japanese. You know, how are they going to sort of maintain this, you know, utterly false facade of plausibility around a war which can't be won militarily and is being essentially fronted by a grossly corrupt regime which is brutalizing its own people? That's the sense here. What happens next, particularly with an eye on Europe?
Well, let's turn to that, Che, and see if you are any better at finding an answer than I am, for I have no answer. As you alluded to there, half the governments in Europe have fallen, in part because of their association with Zelensky. It's like a meme now, the curse of Zelensky. Everyone that's ever shaken hands with him in a chancery or a presidential office somewhere has fallen, often quite soon afterwards. Their economies have been beggared by the war, particularly the German, but all of the European governments have been gravely affected by it. There is no evidence at all that their own public opinion wants them to be doing what they were doing in London this evening. So why are they doing it? What's your guess on that?
Well, I think there's always been a sense about the war in Europe, particularly, that, as I said, so much was invested in the idea that we will stand with Ukraine forever. Nobody wants to be the first person to stand up in the room and say, you know, the emperor has no clothes. This isn't going to work. Now, two have stood up in the room. Robert Fico and Viktor Orban have all along said this can't be won militarily. And these are people who they're very close proximity with the war. But I think the separation, the degrees of separation of places like London, which is, in my view, people like Johnson represent a sort of a post-colonial delusion syndrome. They see the Ukrainian crisis as an ability to exert some sort of influence, to re-establish London as a centre of geostrategic power. And they've done that very aggressively. And Starmer, as a Labour man, as an apparent socialist, has picked up the baton from Johnson very eagerly, which is in many ways repellent, in my view. But there's been so much invested in it, George, in my view. And I've written about this early in the conflict. I said that the most dangerous time is when it's utterly apparent that the war is lost militarily. It's utterly apparent that the Russians can't be defeated, that the Russian economy is actually growing, that all this think tank fantasy, this vacuous, flawed arguing about, Russia being, a fraction damaged society, that the Russian people don't support their president. These sort of tropes that are bouncing around in Whitehall and did bounce around in the White House in the Biden administration seem to only, cure and salve the individuals involved there. It's like the European Union. They love to talk to each other. They're meeting in London tonight, the European leaders. They're not talking to the Russians. Just like they meet in Davos, they meet everywhere. They're great at meeting. They're meeting on trains. They're meeting in these beautiful, luxurious places, but they don't want to talk to the Russians. The Americans, on the other hand, have very quickly established the reality, whether you agree with Donald Trump politically or not, and I said this to you on my last discussion with you, I don't really care what Trump is about once he's about peace. And I think that's really at the center of this. The word peace in Europe, in the EU, is a dirty word. It's something that has to be, which you go and stand in the corner if you dare to utter the word peace, rapprochement, or the ending of this conflict. Now, every conflict in human history ends in negotiation. It's the basic tenet of international diplomacy and war. Von Clausewitz, the greatest strategic writer, in recent history, would have said that, war is politics by another means. It's the continuation of failed political will. And the fact that people like Kaja Kallas and Ursula von der Leyen and Mark Rutte are heading up Europe's, let's say, very flawed view on this war, that it's more war or victory. It's just utterly unsustainable. And the fact that the American president, who was elected by a very large majority in the United States, is being opposed and undermined by people like Kaja Kallas, who was basically sacked as prime minister of the tiny European state of Estonia. There's more people live in Birmingham. People like Mark Rutte, who was sacked by the people of Holland, and Ursula von der Leyen, who was never elected at all, other than by a bunch of crony MEPs in Europe, and has a huge cloud of corruption hanging over vaccines, military contracts with the Bundeswehr. That these are the people that are representing the will of the people of Europe. Meanwhile, the European Union is eagerly pretending there aren't hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of Romania protesting the illegal banning of the results of an election because the wrong guy won the election, Calin Georgescu. And why are they arguing against Calin Georgescu? Because Calin Georgescu wants an end to the war, like Orban wants an end to the war, like Fico wants an end to the war. And so it's almost as if being pro-peace and pro-settlement in Ukraine is almost worse now than being a paedophile in Europe. I mean, you could be anything and get a hearing in Europe right now other than be pro-peace. And in the absence of a left-wing socialist peace movement, which would have usually resided with the Labour Party or with the Democrats in the US, there's an abject lack of that movement, which always fascinates me. This vacuum is filled by this idea, we will stand with Ukraine for 1,000 years, just like Keir Starmer, the 100-year deal with Ukraine. And these grinning smirks as they trot down the corridor after Zelensky being completely, decimated in the Oval Office. That these two men could smirk as they walk down the corridor in 10 Downing Street really demonstrates the vacuous nature of their argument.
They forced the king. They forced the king to pose with them, and maybe they didn't have to force him too much. By the way, if you were a paedophile, you'd probably get a grant from USAID to put on a pantomime or an opera. But now, if you're for peace with Russia, you're right-wing. You're far right, in fact. I could show you my scars. But the puzzling thing for me, Che, is the unanimity of it all. In your country and in mine, every party, everyone, in the Dáil, from the Trotskyites, the Sinn Féin, the Fianna Fáil, the Fine Gael, the Greens, they are all with Zelensky, every single one of them. In our parliament, Tory, Labour, Liberal Democrat, even Reform, even Farage, the Greens, even the Scottish nationalists, even the Welsh nationalists, they are all with Zelensky. I don't understand that, given how far away it is, how much blood has already been lost, how much treasure has already been spent. Why don't these people want the war now to end?
Well, something that always interested me was the idea of this international rules-based order, which is very much like the manufactured phrase, Russia's full-scale, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Anyone who thinks that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked is either willfully ignorant or just stupid, because there's plenty of people outlining in great detail, as you did with Mr. Piers Morgan recently, the irrefutable facts about how this conflict arrived on our doorsteps, this phase of it. So I think that international rules-based order is enforced not really by a written set of rules, because I can't find it written down anywhere. But essentially what it means is we make the rules and we enforce the orders. Okay, so that is the rules-based order. And I also am reminded of the phrase that if voting was any threat to the permanent state and the permanent government in the UK, Ireland, or the United States, they would have banned it years ago. So if you understand, and Dominic Cummings, not a man I'm very fond of, recently gave a very interesting talk on a podcast about how the deep state in the UK essentially has pre-decided all policy prior to the arrival of any prime minister. Vladimir Putin himself said that as soon as you become president, lots of men arrive in the room with dark suits on and red ties and start telling you what to do, but you have to stand them down. You have to chase them out. And this is why this cohesive idea, it's almost Mason-like, I believe, this idea, as you say, that political parties at such polar opposite ends of the scale will coalesce around this idea that they're defending freedom and democracy in a country which has banned elections, which has oppressed minorities, which has harassed and beaten gay people, which has terrorized a significant chunk of its own population since 2014. All history can be erased. History begins on the 24th of February 2022, when Vladimir Putin rolled out of bed in his volcano and stuck a pin in the map and decided to invade the virginal Ukraine. This is the narrative. And I think that is the narrative, not because of any sort of moral obligation to the people of Ukraine. I think it's an obligation to this unwritten Mason-like cohesion around this worlds-based order and this rules-based order, which has, of course, licensed wars in Serbia, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, Grenada, Panama. George, you know the list. So if you actually step back and have a look at it, this is about a Western sort of aggressive ideology around enforcing their rules-based order on people who won't sit down or kneel down when they're told to. And the biggest culprit in not kneeling down when they're told to has been for many hundreds of years, first the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union, and now the good old Russian Federation, which has no intention of kneeling down, has actually been inoculated and strengthened by this war, socially, culturally, militarily. And in the halls of power, in Whitehall, in the Pentagon, and Brussels, they will freely admit this. I speak to people who say, look, we know the war is over, but I'm not going to be the first one to put my hand up and say the emperor has no clothes on, George.
Yeah, they used to say that at party meetings, congresses and so on, nobody wanted to be the last man, or the first man rather, to stop clapping Comrade Stalin. So they just kept on clapping until somebody dropped. But you mentioned the word inoculation there. You and I, have been effectively marginalized, and in your case, having to work outside your country in order freely to speak. If you were in Ireland, you would not be able to speak so freely. We're all in fear of the algorithm, of the suppressor, the censor, all the time. Just today, the No to NATO, No to War Twitter account was banned on Elon Musk's Twitter, even though he's in favor of the abolition of NATO. So von der Leyen has just issued an extraordinary new order, marching order. She said that we are all to be vaccinated against disinformation before we catch it, before we get it, so we won't fall victim to it. It sounds like they have a plan for yet more repression of free speech, the very repression that they denied when J.D. Vance brought it up in the Oval Office. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the new front in this conflict which has shifted now from a proxy war between the United States and the Russian Federation and China to some extent, Iran to some extent, has now definitely shifted to Europe. The EU has now been told by its big brother, you start another fight in the pub, I won't be stepping in for you this time. Okay, so now we have to watch and see, will the EU sit down, shut its mouth, or will it keep antagonizing its big neighbor? But now, it's important that people understand this, that there's no absolutely zero intelligence or plausible analysis that can tell you that the Russian Federation has any plan whatsoever, military or political, to attack NATO, whatever NATO is. NATO is Turkey, NATO is Sweden. There's no no remote sentient evidence of that. Just like there's no evidence that the Soviet Union ever planned to attack NATO or Europe either. So let's get that straight. There's no evidence that Vladimir Putin ever said that the special military operation would take 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months. He never mentioned any time frame, but that's regularly peddled as well. So you have to understand that the momentum of the EU and NATO is completely and utterly shackled to the outcome of this war. I wrote about this a long time back in the conflict, just after this phase of it broke out, saying that there is the NATO is essentially, remember, it's an arsonist that sells fire alarms during the day. So there must be fear of an assault. There must be a reason to fund the military-industrial complex, and there must be a reason to peddle that fear to an ignorant population. So one element of that is making sure people like you and me are, first of all, marginalized, secondly shut down, then threatened. But the most important thing is that we are prevented from inoculating the people of our own countries from this idiotic, absorption of propaganda by osmosis. Now, remember, you sit in your car in Dublin, Glasgow, London, you put on the radio, you're going to be told, the Russians are coming. You read a newspaper, if you do so still. I don't know if anybody actually read newspapers anymore. You put on Piers Morgan, you turn on Sky News, CNN, ABC, BBC. It's just ridiculously coordinated, as was demonstrated by the tweets about supporting Ukraine unconditionally, where I think von der Leyen and 3 or 4 others tweeted the exact same thing. And if that didn't prove to you that this is a coordinated fantasy, I don't know what does. So the momentum has always been escalation. So they escalated, they pushed to bomb Moscow, they pushed to bomb Russian regions. They planned and executed, the British in particular, the Kursk incursion, which has been a catastrophic military disaster for the Ukrainian forces. 70,000 dead, hundreds and hundreds, if not over thousands of vehicles destroyed, mostly Western equipment, while the Russian army continues to encroach eastwards, day by day, village by village, town by town. It's been a complete catastrophe. So the next phase, when the Americans basically told the EU, look, you're going to have to stop bombing the Russians, there's a red line here, we don't want a war with them. What do they do next? They're going to try to replace the money that the Americans have been flushing into Ukraine. No talk about audits, no talk about national, referenda to ask the people of Europe, as you said, is this something you want to do? Because they know that the ordinary people would immediately say, we don't want this war to continue. We want it to end. We want a just peace. So the momentum has to be escalation. The momentum has to be denial. And I think at the stage where these individuals like Johnson and von der Leyen and Guy Verhofstadt and these ugly, it's really repellent, the level of their aggression and hatred and bloodthirstiness, that they have to continue, because if they fail to continue, it's like a shark. As soon as it stops swimming, it dies. And if this war in Ukraine comes to an end, which is seen as unfavorable to NATO, it's the end of NATO. It's probably the end of the EU, and it's the end of this idea of the rules-based order. Now, there's a lot of money, a lot of elites, the World Economic Forum, a lot of globalist cash money and investment in Ukraine, in the European Union, and we know that. And these people will pull the tablecloth out from under the feast before they'll get up and walk away from the table and admit they were wrong. This is not something that they do and won't do lightly. So it's either peace brokered by the United States, which looks a little shaky now, or, as Donald Trump said, I'll let you both fight it out. And if that's the case, we all know that Russia's military production is 4 times that of NATO, particularly in shell production. We all know that they just don't have the depth of manufacturing. They're talking about increasing this, increasing that. It could take 15 years. Will there be a Ukrainian state left if Russia continues its war against it in the current form? In my view, militarily and politically, it's highly unlikely. Who's going to blink first? The Russian Federation?
I'm with you on that. I'm with you on that, Che. It's either peace or a continuation of the war, and a continuation of the war only has one ending, however long it takes. Listen, I'm running out of time, Che. It's always an education to talk with you. Che Bose, political commentator based in Moscow, and a good Irishman, as you heard. Did Zelensky blow Ukraine's last chance in the Oval Office? Duh. Total votes cast so far, 30,662. You've got 15 minutes to get your vote in on Telegram, on X, on the YouTube community poll, or on the YouTube stream. Let me take a quick break, then it's your calls right up to Gayatri's social media roundup. Stay tuned. As the green smoke rose, their faces flashed out, pallid green, and faded again as it vanished. Then slowly the hissing passed into a humming, into a long, loud, droning noise. Suddenly, a humped shape rose out of the pit, and the ghost of a beam of light seemed to flicker out after it. Forthwith, flashes of actual flame, a bright glare leaping from one to another, sprang from the scattered group of men. It was as if some invisible jet impinged upon them and flashed into white flame. It was as if each man were suddenly and momentarily turned to fire. Now you get that and much more besides if you support me and the show on Patreon, patreon.com/George Galloway. I'll be talking with my supporters on Patreon all the way to London on the train and all the way back from London on the train. It gets quite feisty and busy. So if you haven't yet supported me on Patreon, please do. And if you already do, a very big and warm thank you. Now, it's been another huge week on the podcast. We're in the top 20 in Russia again this week. Who knew there were enough English speakers to put us in the top 20? And number 1 in Egypt. Wallahi. If you aren't a subscriber, make sure you become one. You can download the Moats podcast by scanning the QR code on your screen now. But you can also watch it on the ubiquitous new website, moats.tv, when you go to leave your donation. Daniel is on the line in Los Angeles on conscription. Go ahead, Daniel. Daniel, are you there?
Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, we can all hear you. Go ahead. What do you want to say, Dan?
All right. Well, George, pleasure to speak with you. First-time caller. I'm calling from Los Angeles as an American, but also has British citizenship through my mother, who was born there, and her family's coming from England, who still has family in the UK. I'm very worried that conscription seems to be kind of the buzzword because, you know, obviously war needs bodies. Russia has plenty of bodies. I think it's quite plain that the United States is, through the leadership of current president, is not interested in sending more bodies into a meat grinder, literal meat grinder. I think maybe he's had some people coming around him saying, you know, this part of the world has seen war upon war upon war over the centuries, you know, whether most recently the Crimean War to World War II, World War I, ethnic conflicts abound. And I think we're seeing continuation in some ways of the Crimean War, seeing that it was a historic struggle between, you know, British-led forces of France and other countries against Greater Russia. And I think, you know, to me, as somebody who is, you know, understanding of a place for war, when you're defending yourself. I mean, Russia's been pretty clear about how they said this is us standing up for ourselves and our national sovereignty. I think I just wish the UK was a little bit more resolute about defending their own borders, as Russia is. I think the United Kingdom would look a little different. But either way, I wanted to ask your opinion on that regarding, do you think that there is some connection with long-standing feuds at the upper echelons of power, not necessarily the laymen or the soldiers on the field? You know, they're just simply the pawns. But the people, the power elites, you know, who are still leading much of Europe today, and because we see how
well, look,
so many of them are
Daniel, that's another outstanding debut call. That's 2 new calls that have been amongst the best that I have heard on here. I'm coming to Los Angeles in September with Gayatri, God willing. We're probably in the Anaheim area, we'll be speaking. So if you're around, Daniel, please come and see us. It's absolutely the case that the Crimean War was an invasion of Russia by Britain and France. History doesn't repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. And Britain and France also invaded the very same Russia in 1918. Between 1918 and 1922, Britain and France had hundreds of thousands of invading soldiers in Russian territory, trying to interfere in Russia's internal affairs. In fact, the French held Odessa, and the Russians took it back. And personally, I think they'll take it back again. So you would have thought that a somber appreciation of history would lead you to the following conclusion. It was a very bloody and costly war for us to fight Russia in the middle 19th century, since when Russia has become a hypersonically armed nuclear superpower, which has an armed forces that completely dwarf all of ours, that has a military-industrial complex which produces 4 times the amount of ours combined amongst all our countries, 4 times greater. So 4 tanks for every tank, 4 shells for every shell, and 4 aeroplanes for every one. You can gross it up and see. You would think it is sobering experience to contemplate that and to conclude that perhaps another charge of the Light Brigade is not the wisest idea. Many thanks, Daniel, for an excellent call. Aid Chapman says, GG absolutely hollowed out Piers Morgan. Was spectacular and embarrassing for Morgan. Yeah, most people seem to think so, and thank you for all your kind words. Roger Morris says, Piers Morgan can drive the first tank for Blighty, the first of 40, Roger. Antonio Cristoforo says, Piers got more than he reckoned for. A kick up the arsenal by the better man. Thank you, Antonio. Look, a call from England. Christopher in Redcar, but on Ukraine. Go ahead, Christopher.
All right, George, it's Chris McGlade. How are you doing? Long time since we've spoken, especially on your
Chris,
show.
how are you, the workers' poet?
I'm all right, man. Listen, I can't. I'm a comprehensively educated working-class bloke. I can't speak as articulately as the guy from Los Angeles or the Irish fella who spoke before him. But I'll say this, right? I'll speak as I work in my working class circles, right? I feel angry, George, and I feel emotional. I feel as though I'm going to cry now just speaking. And you know, my father was murdered, and I rose above that anger towards me dad's killer. But I feel angry, George, and I'm struggling to overcome the anger that I feel towards the British political class and the British media, right? Because they are responsible for wreaking so much division in this country by spinning untruths, half-truths, lies, inaccuracies all the way down the line. And it's causing so much sort of like bad feeling within the country. You know, I've seen the front page of the Daily Mail today where they are calling Zelensky a war hero, you know, and there's another guy on Twitter, a guy, Ed Krasenstein, I saw today, when they were saying Britain and France and Ukraine are united in creating a ceasefire proposal that they'll then present to the US, and the world is waiting to see if Trump will choose peace. Well, Trump's always been for peace, right? And he's always wanted no killing and death. So they're very cleverly turning it around. The British press and the political class are turning it round to being Trump not wanting peace. And I can't, like, I've had to educate myself over the course of my life through not having the education that I should have had when I was a child. And I've looked at things, and people talk about this war as if it began in 2022, but they're not saying anything about 14,000 Russian-speaking or Russian people being killed between 2014 and 2022. I mean, if our country, we sent soldiers and troops off to the Falklands 10,000 miles away because of the hostilities that Argentina showed British people. If any country lost 14,000 of its people, what do you think the country that they were from would do? Of course, they would try and protect them. And yet these things are never put forward in the press. It's like the public are blindly following people like Keir Starmer, who are just out for themselves and their own globalist ends. And I feel, you know me. I'm not an angry kind of bloke by any stretch of the imagination, but the anger that I'm feeling because of the misinformation and the lies, George, is just, I feel as though it's threatening to engulf me. And why have I come on your show? I don't even know why I've come on your show. I've come on your show because I feel as though I have to vocalise it, you know? I feel as though I have to vocalise it.
I'm glad you did. Chris McGlade is the... yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
Listen, I missed the first... Your studio people called me back. I was in the pub next door to my house. I was sat in the pub next door with all the lads playing pool, and they all think the same. Why are we getting involved with a war? Do you know what it is? I am going to cry now because I took a picture of a basket outside of a food bank with bread in it on Thursday morning, right? And this bloke was going through a pile of wet loaves of bread because poverty in my town is so bad, and yet Keir Starmer is committing billions of pounds to a war that just cannot be won. And it hurts me, George. And the lies and the deception and the deceit around it all, and progressive liberals clapping their hands and shouting and bawling, wanting to bring Donald Trump down when he's the one that wants peace. And it seems to me as though through all of this, through it all, it's as much about destabilising Donald Trump as it is trying to find some solution. They're desperate. The political class, the media class, progressive liberals are desperate to look for any way to destabilise and bring down Donald Trump, even though the man wants peace. And I'm a socialist. My granddad was a communist. You know, I've been of the left all my life. Donald Trump is about as far away from where I am politically as you could ever get. But I applaud him for standing up on the side of peace and right. And that's all I want to say, George.
Well, that's all there is to say, and you said it in a way that nobody else could. It's the best call of the night, best call of many a night. And I'm very glad that you did make the call, and your hatred and detestation of the British political class and the media class, and you're a man who forgave the guy who murdered his father. It's difficult to forgive our politicians because they're trying to murder everybody's son. That was Christopher McGlade, the working class poet of Redcar, well, Middlesbrough, really talking about Ukraine. A big shout out to tonight's top donors who've gone to the website, moats.tv, since we came on air. Johnny Widstrand, Graham Murray, John Kellock, Asma Sharapova, and Alan Ramirez. Thank you very much. God bless you all. Give, why don't you? Either now or overnight. Let me wake up to a proper amount donated on the website this evening. Now, I'll be on the train to London tomorrow to make my other show, Have It Out with Galloway, and you can be on it. Here's how. Join me on Have It Out with Galloway. Be on the studio wall. Participate in the debate about the greatest issues of our time. This is the place where we tackle the world's biggest problems and offer some of the world's best answers. You can have your say. Write to me at our website at haveitoutwithgalloway.com and join me here in the studio audience.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Let's get more on the reaction stateside to the Oval Office fiasco. It was more than a fiasco. I've never, and I've been in politics more than 50 years, I have never seen anything quite like it. Who better to tell us the American reaction than Simon from Florida, from Weaponized News. Simon, welcome back to the show. I'd never seen anything like it. Had you? And how did it go down across the pond?
Mr. Galloway, greetings to you and greetings to your worldwide audience. But in the few minutes remaining, I have much, much worse news than that on a very timely basis, I'm afraid to have to share with you. And this is directly going to affect your individual person. And that's not a threat. It's a very kind warning. So please hear me out on this, because it's going to affect your staff and your family and your callers and the guests and millions of people in England. Okay? So the agreement, the 100-year agreement that was started by Rishi Sunak and signed by Keir Starmer, that we've all been mocking because it didn't have much substance to it and it was just an agreement and wasn't legally binding, has been laid in the last week before the House of Commons and the House of Lords as an official British treaty for ratification. That happened on the 24th of February. And it has been listed under the negative resolution procedures, which I can explain, by LAMI as item number 13 on the 25th of February. The House of Lords has referred it to the International Agreements Committee. Now, in the House of Commons, if the government doesn't allow an opposition debate, which won't happen because the opposition, as you've explained to the audience tonight, don't want to oppose that agreement, the only way this is going to be defeated is if a private member's bill is passed in its entirety within 40 days from the 24th of February. That hasn't happened since 1979. It's going to go into law by default without a debate in the House of Commons. Now, to make it even worse, under Article 11.3, on the last page of that 6 pages of text that was signed by Zelensky and Starmer on the 16th of January, it makes provision for sub-agreements. the same day in the same location, they signed a 16-page sub-agreement, which has the same title with the word declaration added to the end of it. I've put a link to the UK government website where the full text of that is posted on your Rumble chat. I've sent all of these links to your producer, Chris, to your assistant producer, Jaya, and to you by Twitter messages, so people can find those through their sources. None of this is opinion. It's all documented on British government websites. Okay? Now, the House of Lords has launched an inquiry committee to consider both the 6-page 100-year agreement and the 16-page sub-agreement. The deadline for public comment that I would implore your audience to see these links and follow the manner in which you can submit your reasoned comments, not vitriol, reasoned comments, right, is going to be via the House of Lords International Agreements Committee. Now, these two documents combined are 22 pages and are designed, in the case of the Master Agreement, the treaty, to last for 100 years. The House of Lords have summarized it into 7 sentences, and we have 8 days to comment. Okay? They are committing Britain to give £3 billion a year to Ukraine as a minimum for the next 6 years, and to continue support thereafter at unspecified amounts. But in the 16-page agreement, I would draw people's attention expressly to Article 1.3, 3.2, and 7.5. And it's 7.5 that directly threatens you and the British audience, because it says that the British government, in conjunction with the Ukrainian government, who have death lists for their opponents, are going to coordinate countermeasures against individuals who oppose Ukraine. That is in Article 7.5. So that went into immediate effect on the 16th of January. So you, sir, and I'm not exaggerating here, are now a target of the British government. Now, they have an automatic system that can target people via social media done by artificial intelligence that's run by NATO, and it's called Merlin. And it went operational September 2023. And there's no accountability for it whatsoever, because every individual government can say, we don't run that, NATO runs that. Now, today, in Lancaster House, well, you will recall that I broadcast live with you, your favourite Tory MP, Grant Snapps, announcing the 100-year deal at Lancaster House about a year ago to all the British generals sitting there nodding in the front row. They're now talking about forming joint army, British and Ukrainian units, and joint naval task force, British ships sailing with Ukrainian ships in the Black Sea. Joint air units, basically like Churchill proposed to the French in 1940, before the end of the Battle of France and before the start of the Battle of Britain, to merge France with Britain so that France could, because they were half of Britain in a new version of the British Empire. People can look that up. There was a serious plan that got proposed at the cabinet level, but then France collapsed before they signed the agreement, right? This is the level of integration that we are seeing. And the British government is going to use AI to target our citizens. And like they did after Southport, you can see when they come after you for social media quotes that they don't like, they come down on you damn hard. And this pretense that Keir Starmer said we have free speech in Britain and we're proud of it and have had it for many, many decades, that he said directly to the face of Vice President Vance, he knew that was a lie because he had signed the agreement to do this in Article 7.4 and 7.5 of the Declaration, not the Master Treaty, the Declaration, weeks before he flew to Washington. And he knew what he had agreed, and the parliamentary librarian has clarified that this is going to be legally binding. But she said it doesn't have an Article 5 paragraph like the NATO treaty from 1949, which people think is an automatic mutual defense trigger. It is not. It is discretionary.
No.
Each country gets to decide what they do. Article 1.3 of this document makes it compulsory for Britain to come to the defense of Ukraine. Compulsory. Within 24 hours. It's there in writing. So this is incredibly serious. And we have 8 days, including today, to write to the House of Lords using the details they've provided in order to try and have any chance of getting this amended, because it's not even going to be debated.
Well, I'm sure it will not be. I'm sure it will not be amended, even if we had a decent parliament. Getting it amended in such a short period of time would be a very tall order indeed. But as we have a rubber stamp parliament of almost no merit at all, then any hope of amendment is forlorn. It doesn't mean that we should not place on record our opposition to it. Our director of policy, a very clever man called Tim Pendry, I'm sure he'll be listening and will already have probably downloaded it all, but certainly will do so. As for countermeasures against me and against this show, we are constantly dealing with countermeasures, from electronic interference to algorithmic suppression to censorship and attempts to tell us who we can and cannot have on our show, and so on. And we'll continue to broadcast here as long as we can. But if the day comes when it is no longer possible freely to speak in Britain, then we will go into exile, most probably in the United States of America. Isn't that a remarkable turn of events? Simon from Weaponized News, thank you for that most powerful clarion call. Well, it's Gayatri's social media news roundup. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Let me start off by sending blessed Ramadan greetings to all our Muslim audience throughout the world.
Amen.
You may have seen imageries from Gaza where the people are still living amongst the rubble, but the steadfast Palestinians have nevertheless committed to this holy month. Piers Morgan, I know you don't want to talk about it, but we've received so many messages, and I'm just going to read this one because it links to the rest of the show. Mike Dyke says, Piers was trying to say just because Zelensky is a Jew, he can't be a Nazi. I'm Canadian, and I've watched Zelensky in the Canadian Parliament giving fist pumps to a Ukrainian Nazi. Who remembers that one? That was from 2033.
Who could forget it?
That elderly man being saluted. Costing,
the whole Parliament,
the whole Parliament,
standing ovation,
costing the job of the Speaker of the Canadian House.
Yeah.
So to say
he was an SS general.
Yes, imagine that. So to say Zelensky didn't know he was a Nazi would be a stretch, because obviously he met with the Nazi in the Prime Minister's office before. Saying Zelensky can't be pro-Nazi is like saying Netanyahu can't commit genocide because he's Jewish, or that a person of color cannot be racist.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's perfectly apparent, but I want to make it clear. I did not, in fact, say that Zelensky was a Nazi.
No.
I said that there are plenty of Nazis in powerful, influential positions inside his regime, and no one can deny that. I just reposted a piece from the Jerusalem Post about the naming of a street in Kiev after a Nazi SS butcher of Jews and Poles and Slavs of varying nationalities. And no one can deny that. That was in the Jerusalem Post, and the street is there for anybody to see. And the idea, as Morgan tried to spin it, that there's only a handful of Nazis in Ukraine, Well, this just so flies in the face of the truth. You've got to conclude that it's a deliberate attempt to deceive. Sorry, go on. It's not that I don't want to talk about it. I mean, I'm glad that I gave him another doing, as we say in Glasgow, but I feel that probably he's enjoying it. Mm. He's enjoying these hundreds of thousands of people kicking him, lashing him after the interview with me. And I got to thinking, maybe masochism is the operative word.
Yeah, like Jerry Springer. So the poll this week, did Zelensky blow Ukraine's last chance in the Oval Office? The dichotomy that you laid before us earlier was very interesting. Those who are pro-war, prompting Zelensky, and those who are pro-peace and are being put on the Trump side. Well, His Holiness the Pope Francis, despite being in such poor health, with pneumonia, hospitalized, missing his public appearances, he made his effort to send a message for peace in Ukraine too. So we're on his side too. And this was, by the way, after he earlier made a phone call to the Catholic Church in Palestine too.
In Gaza.
In Gaza.
He phoned every night to Gaza until he was hospitalized.
But even from the hospital.
But from the hospital, he's now rephoned that church.
So we send our prayers to Pope Francis. So in response to this poll, Dan says, well, this situation is now uncannily close to the film Wag the Dog, with the puppet Zelensky increasingly believing his own hype and barking back at his masters, emboldened by puffed-up European technocrats desperate to keep public attention off their own disastrous domestic policies. My bet is that Trump and or Putin make a better offer to real power brokers in the former Ukraine to get rid of the little dictator and install somebody more amenable to doing business. Now, this movie, a classic one, Wag the Dog, with Robert De Niro and Dustin Hoffman, this was about a fabricated war in Albania to distract the people from the presidential sex scandals. And who would have thunk it? The film was released in '97, only 1 month before the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal. I mean, as if it was made for it. And only 2 years later, the Clinton administration bombed Yugoslavia right next to Albania. I mean, what are the coincidences? But it is all bread and circuses, isn't it? But
yeah, it was a good film. I haven't seen it for many years, probably not since then. We better watch it together.
Should, yes.
To see the comparison with recent events here. Yeah.
So, Gene Depp's fan, if I read correctly, she donated $10 US, saying Trump Zelensky was kabuki theater, playing to Donald's power while portraying Zelensky as fighting for his people. Hogwash. Even today, this story is playing this BS. Now, Wilson says, has there ever been a time so many idiots are in position of power whilst possessing no leadership qualities, no honor, no morality, no democracy, oppose freedom and freedom of speech, care not a jot about human rights, complicit in genocide, happily fund regime change, war and corruption, with the latest leaving 1 million Ukrainian dead, 100,000 Russian dead, and over 200,000 Palestinians dead.
And I think 9 million Ukrainians abroad. I mean, Ukraine is now a skeletal version of what it was. They are dragging people by the hair into vans and packing them off to the front. The sons and daughters of the oligarchy have driven their luxury cars to the Riviera, to Geneva, to anywhere but the front in Ukraine. The amount of corruption and theft involved with the government and state and the officer class in Ukraine is literally unprecedented. And still these idiots are on their feet like clapping seals for the personification of this mess, namely Volodymyr Zelensky. I think it's only going to end in further disaster. I myself have no faith that there's going to be a peace agreement. I think Russia will have to fight to liberate the entire Russian-speaking area. and to absorb them into the Novorus, including the coast. They cannot allow the Black Sea to be a NATO lake, especially after what Simon just told us about this treaty, about joint naval exercises and so on. This is a mortal threat to Russia's security. So I personally think that there will be no peace deal. I was very hopeful that Trump would pull it off, but I now think that this war will have to be fought to a military conclusion. You got anything else? One last?
I just want to finish his message, because Wilson continues saying that leaders, they are nuts. And Starmer is cluelessly clinging on to a failed agenda. He hasn't got another thought in his empty, blank-faced head. Now, as he speaks of leaders, and you're being the leader of the Workers' Party, I just want to congratulate you on the 1-year anniversary of the Rochdale election, which was yesterday, 1 year ago. I mean,
it's hard to believe it was only a year ago. So much has
happened. Where the Parliament today could use a leader of the Workers' Party, member of Parliament, desperately.
Thank you, most kind. The thing I remember most about the 1 year ago is little Rishi Sunak pulling his soapbox out of number 10 Downing Street in the dark, having flown on an RAF jet
all the way
from Lossiemouth, to make a statement that didn't actually say anything meaningful. And I'm genuinely still trying to work out what that was all about. Was it all a dream? Well, Gayatri, on the question of leadership, I think that on most other foreign policy issues, we would have grave disagreements with Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, particularly on the obvious one that you mentioned right at the beginning, the Israel-Palestine track, the Middle East in general. But I think that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance did demonstrate, whether they'll keep it up or not, it remains to be seen, now that it's run into such heavy water. They demonstrated real leadership in trying to bring about an end to the war in Ukraine. Barack Obama got a Nobel Prize before he even took office. I think that Trump's efforts are admirable. But the main thing that I've picked up, and I've been saying this, as you know, from the beginning, from when he was first elected to the Senate, if ever there was a vice presidential upgrade, it is Mike Pence to J.D. Vance. Vance is a very interesting figure indeed, and as Zelensky found out, quite a formidable one at that. Let's take a final call from a final legend. It's Erebos in New York on Zelensky. On you go, legend. What do you want to say?
Salubrious late evening, Mr. G. To you, your family, the wonderful Mrs. Gayatri Galloway, in her UN, Secretariat UN formal attire. She looks great. Yeah. Our shout out to Christopher and Professor Simon. They're very agitated, very emotional, both sympathy and empathy with them. It's a lot of stress sometimes trying to deal with all this information and all these events coming at us, like filling up a teacup with a fire hose. I just wanted to inject a little levity right quickly, since time is always against us. You were mentioning about Piers, right? Piers Morgan, and he's like a big, bloated, wide guy. He has a wide back. He looks like a big cream puff. And I was thinking about Paddle Piers, right? Maybe he's into paddling with a cricket bat. This guy. I mean, you look at him and his back is so wide, you could put him in the middle of a dance hall throw a boomerang with your eyes closed, and it will stick in the crack of his ass with no. It will just find him. It will just find its way there. No problem at all. This guy. But yeah, he's probably is a masochist. I could see that with his rougey, ready cheeks, getting spanked, begging for more. However, to move on to yet another masochist, the little green man from not from Mars, but from a country calling itself the Borderlands, right? Little Agent Gangrene over there. He reminds me of all 5 of the Diem brothers from South Vietnam wrapped up into one person, right? If you took all 5 of the Diem brothers, and obviously he has no historical context. They at least 3 of them were on the same track. And when the U.S. got tired of them, what happened to them, right? 2 allegedly got shot in the back of an armored personnel carrier, and the other one was sentenced to death, and he was shot. And, and all the same talking points and everything they did with the little green man, little Agent Gangrene, they did with the Diem brothers. I think 2 of them were spared that fate as they found Jesus, or they were on the road to Damascus and had different careers. In any event, he's heading on that same road. There's that meme with Bin Laden, the guy from Panama, Saddam, and all these people reaching out from the heavens, reaching down to him, getting ready to clutch him and take him upstairs and into the basement. But the thing about Zelensky is, I think he has to do that because he'll be killed by the Nazis that are there, right? They're constantly around him. They're his personal guard. And they told him back in, I would say, fall of 2022, when he wanted them to stop firing in Donbass, and they told him, if you don't get out of here right now, we're going to kill you. And if you sign a peace agreement, that's the end of you. You could forget about it. So he's literally putting on this performance for his life. He can't go back. If I was him, I'd go to France or yet be another Ukrainian ambassador to the UK and just file for asylum and just, throw my hands up and say, hey, I'm British now, I'm French now, I'm one of the Anglos. I just completely abandoned that whole project there because, he's going to end up like the Diem brothers. And I appreciate the time and much blessings to the Moats family, the audience.
Oh, it was brilliant. It was brilliant, the historical analogy with the Diem brothers and many, many others, of course, is perfect. And paddling piers has got me thinking. It's probably given birth to 100 memes. Paddling piers on his ass with a cricket bat. What a thought to close the show with. Thanks for that, Erebos in New York. On Zelensky, our last call of the evening. I'm already more than 10 minutes after the scheduled end of the show. I appeal to you again, please give generously as you can at moats.tv. Support us on patreon.com. And if you do it tonight, you can chat with me tomorrow on our way to London. Thank you, Gayatri, for the social media roundup. I'll be back with Have It Out with Galloway on Tuesday night at 7 p.m. on my YouTube channel. And of course, with the midweek Mother of All Talk Shows on Wednesday, 7 o'clock UK time. All platforms, at least for now. Thanks for watching.
It's the mother of all talk shows. It's the mother of all talk shows. It's the mother of all talk shows. Go get 'em, George.